6 feline ears all twitched as they turned quiet for a moment, listening to the ongoing argument happening just outside their door that had progressively crescendoed into straight-up yelling over the last few minutes.
"You aren't going to prevent us from protecting ourselves!"
The barking chatter of a party they had so far only heard and not seen rang out. Tian Soko, by the sound of them. The voice of the lumbering primates with 4 awkward arms were quite distinctive, even among the many species of the galaxy.
"We know that the favourite meal of those felines is primate meat, and since there are no defenceless beasts for them to gut alive on this station, we are not going to wait until they finally drop their masks and try to get their fix some other way. The primates of this station will..."
"Sir, we humans are primates as well." A far calmer yet still firm voice interrupted the rant abruptly as one of the soldiers guarding the door rained on his parade. "I assure you none of us have any worry about the Miet taking a bite out of us."
"Primates? Hardly!"
The ranting voice almost immediately piped back up again.
"You're a hairless bunch of flesh-eating freaks! You look a lot more like those monsters to me than you resemble any of us!"
"There is no reason to get insulting, sir." The voice of the human soldier replied again, still as professional as it was stern.
"Or what?"
the Tia Soko challenged.
"Will you shut me up? Put me in my place? What are you going to do, predator? Looking for a fitting excuse to butcher me?"
Inside of the room, one of the felines scoffed. "They always make it sound like they would enjoy that somehow," Zishiji commented in Simoit. His comment gained some exhausted twitches of lip corners that never quite morphed into full-on smiles from his company. "No, but I will call the local authorities on you if you don't curb your aggression," the human replied, unflinching as a rock.
"Call the guards on me because I am telling the truth?"
the yelling person called out in an almost smug and victorious voice, earning him loud chatters from the unseen comrades presumably backing him up. It seemed like he really thought he had some sort of high ground there. "Call the guards on you because you are openly threatening violence against an acting councilman," the human replied dryly.
"Psst! A councilman? Sure!"
the boisterous primate responded with clear sarcasm and disdain.
"I don't accept that bloodthirsty creature as one of our leaders. It doesn't have the same..."
"Have fun explaining that to law enforcement," the human interrupted yet again. "I am sure they would love to hear why you think that you only have to follow the rules that you accept." The smug chatter suddenly died down a bit. If she'd had to guess, she figured the human had actually pulled out his phone to make the call now. The Tia Soko tried to speak up again. His voice carried far less of the earlier smugness now, even if he still tried to keep that fire burning. "I will be sending them pictures of you as well as detailed recordings of everything you said." The human cut him off immediately. "Hope the clicks are worth the criminal record, jackass." Judging by that last comment, there were probably more cameras than just the soldiers' body cams involved. There was more chattering now, though this time it was entirely in the Tian Soko's own language that no one in the vicinity understood apart from the primates themselves. It sounded stressed, though. Then, a moment later, the voices quickly began to become more quiet as the sound of awkward running filled the air, which the feline's fine hearing perfectly picked up on despite it being muffled by the door.
"Oh, now that it's too late, they run,"
Commander Girionora commented with an annoyed roll of her eyes. She let out a deep mixture between a sigh and a hiss as her shoulders sank slightly and her ears lay flat down onto her head.
"Honestly, I am starting to wonder if I should hate evolution for making our main prey primates. I mean, of all the things it could have been."
"Don't let them get to you," Zishiji replied in a firm voice almost instantly. "If you say things like that, you'll make it seem like we actually did something wrong. Our ancestors were animals, hunting other animals. It happens on every planet there is. It is part of nature, and has been around almost since nature began. Don't just let them build this narrative that it is somehow something new and scary." Girionora nodded hesitantly. However, Shida crossed her arms and released an annoyed growl. "Well, we can't pretend like we haven't been allowing that for quite a while," she said under her breath. The comment sounded generally annoyed at the world. However, in reality, it was largely directed at herself. Once upon a time, she had been quite guilty of very much feeding into the stereotype, after all. Jirionora huffed, and briefly rubbed her hands over her ears in order to calm herself a bit. Once her ears had perked back up, she let out another sigh. "Well, at least they left before the ambassador came." Zishadi released an amused snicker at that. "I'm sure he would have torn them a new one," he commented, before running a hand along the long part of his hair. "They sure are getting loud, though." "Spurred on by an old idiot who should have gone to jail ages ago." Shida growled again, her crossed arms tightening around her body a bit more. "Maybe we're lucky and he'll give himself an aneurysm before the election goes through." Zishiji and Jirionora both gave a single, only slightly restrained laugh. "You should be careful with saying things like that too loudly," Zishidi advised, but Shida quickly shook her head. "They can have me on record saying that," she proclaimed confidently. "I don't think violence should be involved, but we would all be better off if he worked himself up enough to just keel over." Zishadi shifted his lips slightly, his tail giving a gentle sway. "I'm going to have to ask you to not talk about one of my colleagues like that," he then stated in a firm voice, though the way he put emphasis on have indicated that it was very much something he felt compelled to do, instead of something he did out of conviction. "Hopefully he won't be one of your colleagues for long anymore." Shida gave back to that, her own towel also swaying, but far more agitated than that of the acting councilman. So much so, in fact, that the commander tilted her head slightly. "Are you alright, Shida?" Jirionora asked, her voice pivoting gently into hesitant worry. Shida released a sharp breath through her teeth and unknotted her arms, running her hands up to glide her fingers through her rebellious mane of hair, then tangling them slightly in a mild grip. "I'm just getting myself worked up now," she admitted, after a moment of introspection. "Guess I should be careful to not give myself that aneurysm I wish upon others." Jirionora smiled at the humorous de-escalation, though a bit of that earlier worry remained on her face. "Should we change the topic until James arrives?" she proposed. However, Shida let go of her hair and waved the idea off. "I think I need to get my head clear," she established. "My therapist said I should be using my energy productively whenever it starts building up. I think I'm going to grab some of the boys and meet James halfway." Jirionora and Zishadi exchanged a brief glance with each other that ultimately ended with Zishadi giving a mild shrug. "Alright, just be careful and make sure to take the escort with you," Zishadi reminded firmly, as if that wasn't exactly what Shida had just said she was going to do. Shida gave a hint of an eye roll, but then saluted the acting councilman and commander before heading out the door. A group of soldiers to accompany her was quickly gathered, and so it didn't take long before she was heading in the vague direction that she knew James and the others would be coming from. Of course, she shot him a quick message, informing him of her new plan, but there wasn't much of a reaction apart from an "alright, be safe." Then again, what else was he going to say? Shida quickly had to admit to herself that she probably wouldn't have been happy with any reasonable answer, and that she was simply still looking for something to be upset over. At least in regards of recognizing her own behaviors, the therapy had been a great help so far. When it came to actually doing something about them once she recognized them, well... She started to breathe more deeply, going through a few breath exercises in hopes to simmer down her growing agitation a bit. It was annoying to have to go through because just the day before, she had been almost perfectly fine for once. Even news that were far worse than a bunch of dipshits coming and yelling obscenities while threatening violence they had no chance of going through with, hadn't been able to get a rise out of her then. But now, just thinking about a senile old asshole was enough to get her blood boiling. These good day, bad day exchanges were starting to press down on her mood even further, and for a moment, she wondered if she had always been like this. And if so, how she used to deal with it. However, After a moment of thinking about it, she realized that she basically just used to be grumpy all the time, so there were no real swings to her mood back then. Of course, that wasn't really any comfort either. Still, with her breathing constant and her mind somewhat distracted from walking and the soldiers around her, she indeed felt herself calm down a bit. At least the advice of use the energy when it builds up seems to be working. Somewhat. Better than nothing, certainly. Although, as a group of passersby suddenly perked up and began to move in her direction, she figured that the peaceful time was already over, and that this day just had no plans of allowing her to calm down at all. Though to her surprise, things turned out quite different from her expectations, as the soldiers accompanying her, of course, immediately moved to intercept the approaching people.
"Sorry, you're going to have to keep your distance,"
the leading sergeant announced, his weapon still pointing to the ground with activated safety in a relaxed manner. "Just a second and we'll be through so you can continue with your day. Sorry for the inconvenience." "Oh," the foremost person of the approaching civilians said, stopping dead in her tracks as she looked at the sergeant with a slightly surprised expression at first, which then relatively quickly turned into a somewhat saddened one. The gaze of the young Aloxilaya tilted slightly to look past the human and towards Shida, her black scales reflecting the station's bright lights in a gentle shimmer. "Oh, I understand," she then mumbled. It sounded like her words were genuine, even if she didn't exactly sound happy about them. "We just wanted to say hello, but I understand that you're all probably not eager to talk to too many people right now." The group behind the comparatively small reptiloid looked to be a healthy mix of various people. Shida spotted a Grassogap, a Marcasilipare, and even a Ketzir among them. All of them were of a young adult age, probably around the range where one would either begin advanced studies or start their first real job. There was something comforting about it, seeing young people like that, hailing from all kinds of worlds, just hang out with each other. "Sorry, friends, but we're not doing meet and greets right now," the sergeant excused with an apologetically raised hand. "But we appreciate..." He stopped when Shida put a hand on his shoulder. The man actually flinched slightly, as he apparently had not noticed her approaching at all. "Ma'am?" he said, in a tone that indicated he was about to tell her to step back again, but Shida was quicker. "It's okay," she assured the man. "They're just saying hello, and we can clearly see that they're not armed. Be on the lookout for anything suspicious." The sergeant brought his heels closer together and nodded. "Yes, ma'am," he confirmed, as he found himself horribly outranked here. Then he took a step aside, allowing Shida to directly approach the youngsters. "Hello there," she greeted, with a hand raised to a gentle wave. "I'm afraid James isn't around right now." The group of young adults stiffened a bit, as they actually found themselves face to face all of a sudden. "Oh, that's fine," the Aloxilaya, who was clearly the boldest of the group despite her size, quickly replied. "We just saw you passing by and, wanted to tell you that you're doing good work." The reptiloid's 4 legs stepped in place a bit nervously, as she clearly tried her best to phrase what she had to say in a respectable manner. "Obviously, Candidate Orwin is in the public eye a lot, but he always talks about how much help all of the people on his team are, and how he couldn't do any of it alone," she then continued. "So, I'm sure you're playing an important part, even if the cameras aren't on you as often." Shida smiled gently. She didn't exactly feel flattered or anything like that. She wasn't vying for recognition, but she most certainly liked that these punks at least seemingly understood what they were actually trying to tell the galaxy. "Sounds like you got good heads on your shoulders," she complimented, and began to briefly scan over every face in the group, deciding to stow those memories away in the back of her mind in case their paths would ever cross again. "Is it true that one of my people touched your tail at the Conference of Primates?" the Grassogap asked her, as she was busy committing each of their appearances to memory. Shida chuckled a bit. "Oh yeah," she confirmed. The memory was anything but funny, for the most part, but in this context she could find some amusement in it. "You should have heard the smack when James stopped my hand from slapping the guy. I think my wrist was red for the rest of the week, and he probably would have learned 3 new languages if it actually hit him." The group chuckled with her, though the female Marcasilla gave her male counterpart a slightly sly glance. "I'm not sure I would like it if you stopped me from slapping someone who touched me without permission," she told him, to which the male released a chittering sound, his long wings briefly vibrating in place. "Well, things are different when you're at a political event," Sheeta reminded them with a sideways nod, while saving the last few faces in her memory banks. He also made extra sure that the guy apologized. With that, she moved to bring her gaze from the tall Ketsir back down to the much shorter person that had begun the conversation. Though, as she briefly looked just past the group in the process of doing so, her mind was almost instantly consumed by an intense ringing all at once, instantly taking up every one of her senses as her eyes caught just the briefest glance. No. Almost more of an idea of a glance of someone. It was so brief, so short, so minuscule that she was in no way sure if she had actually seen it, or if her eyes had simply played a trick of light and motion on her. However, her brain did not care if it had actually seen it or not. Just the idea that she had was enough already, as everything else was immediately pushed into the background. Her vision tunneled in onto the exact point where she had thought she saw it. The voices of the youngsters talking to her were drowned out by the incessant ringing filling her ears. Her mouth went dry as her nose filled with a deeply familiar scent that she could have impossibly picked up from this distance, and yet to her brain it was no less real than if it had been right under her nose. Even her skin began to tingle in a prickly feeling like pins and needles that began in the tips of her fingers but quickly spread all over her body and became especially noticeable on her scalp, wherever her hair rubbed over her skin. Before a single true thought could form in her mind, she began to walk towards it. However, she didn't get more than 2 steps in before she was stopped in her tracks by a hand on her shoulder. "Ma'am?" Her attending sergeant addressed her in a firm and questioning manner, barely breaking through the ringing in her ears, as Sheeta had to fight her gaze away from the spot her brain wanted to endlessly fixate on. Still, as the grip on her shoulder remained unrelenting until she would explain herself, she eventually managed to wrestle her mind back under control enough to form a somewhat coherent thought. "Over there," she said, and lifted her finger to point in the direction. I think I just saw Captain Uton." The sergeant's head poked up a bit as he followed her pointing finger with his gaze. Obviously there was nothing to see at the junction between this main walkway and a somewhat smaller side street anymore. Sheeta herself had only seen the man for a brief fraction of a moment, after all. "Captain Uton," the human mumbled for a second. "As in, Ferrimore Uton, the wanted fugitive? What would he be doing here?" Sheeta shook her head. "I don't know, but he was there," she said, her brain injecting her voice with far more confidence in that statement than she actually felt. "Are you sure?" the sergeant questioned again. Sheeta released an annoyed breath that wasn't exactly aggressive, but certainly vented a lot of unnecessary displeasure. "I have grown up and served under that man's command for 10 years of my life. I know him when I see him," she firmly stated, once again expressing far more certainty with her words than she actually felt. However, although she knew that on an intellectual level, her brain would not allow her to do anything else right now. The sergeant seemed slightly hesitant, but nodded. "We're going to have to call that in," he said, and immediately activated his radio. "You can do that while we walk." Sheeta returned, and began her march again, pulling herself loose from the man's grip. "If we wait any longer, he'll be gone." It was a complete knee-jerk reaction, and a part of her was internally screaming at her to please think logically. However, that part was drowned out by a much louder one. One that wouldn't even take the tiniest chance to possibly let that man go if she had actually seen him. Not him. Not that person that her gut simultaneously loved and hated almost more than anyone else in the world. The sergeant nodded again and motioned for his team to move. Many of the humans gave brief glances and excusing gestures to the young people, who were basically left standing there, dumbfounded at what was happening before their noses. Still, the soldiers were professionals, and with an actual potential threat awaiting them, they quickly brandished their weapons, though they kept holding them in a safe manner that would not endanger any random passerby. Over the ringing in her ears, Sheeta could vaguely hear how the sergeant actually called in what they were doing, though her hearing vehemently refused to pick up on any details. Her own hand lowered onto her sidearm as she quickly approached the corner of the crossing street. Looking down along the way, nothing out of the ordinary was visible so far. He had already gone further. Well, if he was there at all. Before she really knew it, Sheeta was already moving down the side street, her pace increasing consistently as she went, to the point that any other pedestrians were stepping out of her way in mild shock, only after she had already passed them, since they only really noticed her reckless speed when she was already gone. Within moments, she had reached the next fork in the road already, leaving her with two possible ways that the captain could have fled in. To her right, the way soon culminated into a large building that looked to be some sort of extravagant entertainment centre. To her left, however, the way continued openly. One of the two was certainly a better hiding spot. However, Sheeta's instincts told her something else. Following nothing but her gut, she turned left and continued what was by now a full-on sprint along the street, meaning the distance until she once again had to debate between two possible paths was crossed within seconds. She just briefly glanced down the alleyway that offered a different option from just following the road further, originally planning to stick to her current path, until her eyes caught on the sand-coloured fur during her brief glance down the other path. And this time, she was sure. "There!" she yelled out to alarm the soldiers with her, before sprinting after the man with her gun fully drawn. "Stop!" she then ordered, as Uton turned the next corner. Of course he didn't stop, but that didn't matter. There was no way he could get away. No, she was faster. Much faster. He was done. He would be done. There was no getting away. No matter what, she would hunt him down. With time basically skipping from the moment she saw him to her reaching that same corner within her mind, she stopped dead when she looked down the next street and found it empty. Looking along the path, it was way too long for the old primate to have crossed it in that same time. He couldn't be around the next corner. "He's got to be around here somewhere," she said loudly, and levelled her weapon now that there were no civilians around. "Spread out and stay vigilant, Sergeant." Things went silent for a moment as she awaited an answer. Her ear twitched slightly, as she began to wonder if her preoccupied mind was once again blocking out sounds. However, as she finally managed to actually glance around for a second, instead of just staring at what was ahead, she quickly realized that she was alone. "Sergeant?" she asked, looking behind herself fully now. But no dice, no humans in sight. Sheeta's tail began to sway quickly, and for a moment, she started to panic. What had happened to her escort? Had she missed an attack? Had she left them to fend for themselves due to her tunnel vision? However, as rational thought found a door to enter her brain again, she put two and two together and realized something. She was faster than Uton, yes. However, she was also much faster than even a well-trained human. Meaning, in all likelihood, she had simply shaken her own escort on accident as she had began running. Biting her lip, she reached for her radio. "Sergeant?" she said, in a tone that sat squarely between exasperation and sheepishness. "Ma'am, is everything alright?" The sergeant's voice quickly replied, having a very slight panicked twinge to it. "I know you're in command, but you can't just run off like that." "Yes, I know," Sheeta replied. "I'm Her word became stuck in her throat as her ear twitched once again, picking up on the faint sound. That was, however, still more than enough for her ears to detect. "Stealing our trick," she thought, as she realized that the sound was coming from under her feet. Quickly, she turned to follow the way in front of her again. Now she knew that there had to be an entrance to the space between the hull and the station's innards around here somewhere. "Ma'am?" the sergeant's voice repeated through the radio, obviously worried that she had so suddenly cut off. "Come in, ma'am." "Uton escaped into the maintenance space," Sheeta quickly replied. "I'm looking for the entrance he took." "We're going to meet back up with you, ma'am," the sergeant immediately said. We lost you at one of the corners. Which way did you take? Sheeta's lips shifted a bit. Left, opposite from the entertainment center, then immediately into the next alley, she described, just as her eyes widened a bit as they fell onto a thin, barely noticeable gap in the floor. She approached it quickly and knelt down, running the pad of her finger along the very slight unevenness. I think I found the entrance, Sheeta informed over the radio. Copy that, ma'am, the sergeant confirmed immediately. Stand by, we'll be there in a minute. Sheeta listened to that, as she stared down at the now obvious hatch, trying her best to decipher how she would possibly get that open. Ma'am? The sergeant's voice came through again a moment later, clearly awaiting confirmation. Sheeta wanted to reply. However, as she tried, she suddenly realized that her mouth was clenched shut to the point where her jaw was actively quivering. She had to put actual effort into prying her teeth apart, her body seemingly working against her as she did. Copy, she said, once she had finally managed to actually open her fucking mouth. Rational thought winning out over gut reaction at the last possible moment. Standing by. Her eyes were still glued to the hatch. However, she balled her searching fingers into a fist. This was already going to have consequences. The best she could do right now is not making it any worse by diving headfirst into what could so very well be a trap. It was a good thing that Uton's sudden, unexpected disappearance had stopped her in her tracks for a moment, and it was really hard for even her to say what would have happened had that not been the case. However, although she had to stop this chase, one thing was certain now. He was here. They had to get him, and she already knew that she would not be able to rest until they achieved that. As he crossed the corner within the tight crawl space, that was only dimly lit by a tiny flashlight he was carrying with him, Uton stopped and looked over his shoulder. His lips pressed tightly together as he looked back, mixed feelings stirring in his gut as he did. For a moment, it felt almost as if his feet and knuckles were glued to the ground, refusing to carry him any further. That was until a voice broke through the silence. You must really have a death wish, the familiar, ever so charming accent said, as its owner pulled the former captain's attention towards herself. You know she could have shot you there. Are you willing for her to actually do it? You heard what the computer man said. Uton released a slow breath as he turned his head to look back at Sky. Yes, she very well may have, he confirmed, as his limbs finally found the motivation to move again. And no, I don't have a death wish, but if she kills me, that will be that. Sky tilted her head slightly. In the process, she had to watch out for the parts that were left of her antlers to not get caught in any of the tubes, wires and pipes that littered this entire space between floor and hull of the station. Sounds like mixed messages, she commented on his words, which admittedly made Uton chuckle a bit. Maybe they are, he confirmed, now fully getting into motion again. Sky quickly joined up with him as he walked, her multiple ear flaps moving to focus on his voice as they walked next to each other. But there is a difference between wanting to die and being content with it. Sky huffed a bit. Sounds like excuses to me, she said honestly, and her words caused Uton to hang his head a bit. Maybe, he replied, unsure if he could fully deny her words. Still, I have things to do in this existence that I will look to fulfill for as long as I still can. Things, eh? Sky replied, never letting more than a second go by before continuing the conversation. Like making her run after ya? She nodded back in the direction where Sheeta would very soon be coming after them. Uton gave an acknowledging tilt of his head. It worked quite well, didn't it? He pointed out. And yes, it had worked. Even better than he may have expected. It seemed like the things that Abbott said were more true than he would have imagined. Sheeta was indeed very motivated by his presence. Motivated enough that Sky was right. This little test alone could have very well spelled his end, and he was lucky that it didn't. Or at least, he told himself that.
If I can make her run after me, that is already quite a big advantage, he explained, in a brief moment of tactical thinking. The method doesn't matter. As long as you can steer where your opposition moves, that is something you can use. And it's not just her who moves. When she follows me, there are those who will follow her.
Sky hummed for a moment, her hooves clacking along the bare metal ground.
And that's worth sitting your neck out. They know you're here now.
And it will make them all the more eager to find me, Utron replied. That is enough for me.
He could see it in his periphery that another comment was burning on Sky's lips. However, that time, the young Deathworlder actually seemed to hold herself back as she thought for a moment.
I don't get ya,
she then finally stated, obviously swallowing whatever actual remark she was going to make. Utron's gaze lowered to the ground and remained there for a while.
I'm glad you don't,
he finally stated.